be a win for Mike Pence. What does he want to come back with exactly?
Well, first and foremost, he wants to pressure the Chinese to address North Korea. And in fact, that is why President Trump is not labeling the Chinese as a currency manipulator. We're all anticipating that FX report, but they feel that that could be a point of leverage as they negotiate with China to address the North Koreans. And of course, this is the first trip for Vice President Mike Pence as he does this. And it comes just a little more than a week after President Xi Jinping met with President Trump in Florida to discuss a host of issues, including the economy and national security.
But Kevin, what would prod North Korea and not actually sort of awake the sleeping giant, if you like? Why is it in China's interest to get involved here?
Well, let's remember that previous administrations have always relied, Vonnie, on the Chinese to address North Korea. But look, if the Chinese do not act aggressively enough regarding North Korea, the administration is hoping that a bipartisan coalition in Congress led by House Speaker Paul Ryan, who is meeting as we speak with NATO allies overseas and will be in London later this week to give an address on NATO, again coming just a few days after President Trump had met with the head of NATO. Again, they're hoping that this send a signal with the aggressive action taken on Syria, that'll send a signal to North Korea should the Chinese not act.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is now the Chinese are backed into a corner a little bit, so they sort of almost have to do something or they look weak. And then there's the 5-year meeting going on later on this year. What might they do, Kevin?
Well, that's a great point. And, you know, I think that from a broader standpoint, that then candidate Donald Trump on the campaign trail faced a lot of questions about whether or not he was going to work with NATO allies. Now, later this week, the Italian prime minister is going to be in Washington to meet with President Trump. In addition to that, again, a bipartisan coalition in Europe. And so this, I think, is a complete reversal from what we saw on the campaign trail, where President Trump is essentially saying that he's going to work with NATO, provided that the allies pay their fair share. But again, the Chinese and working and trying to juxtapose economic trade relations with national security, previous administrations haven't been as successful at that. It'll be interesting to see whether or not President Xi is willing to play ball with President Trump on this in hopes to try to get something done on auto deals or even more broader trade agreement. But again, that's going to only rely on whether or not President Xi is willing to take North Korea directly on.
Well, let's play out a scenario. Say President Xi doesn't, and Donald Trump has said, we'll go it alone. That'll be quite all right if China doesn't want to play with us here. What if Donald Trump decides to let North Korea have it, if you like? So we've heard from Mike Pence that you wouldn't want to test Donald Trump's resolve. What if North Korea plays this bluff and says, well, we're quite happy to test your resolve. What are you going to do?
You know, right after the Syria missile strike, the U.S. forces moved some naval ships off of the Sea of North Korea. And then following that, what you saw was a media report from the state-sponsored North Korean media report in which they said that they would be able to test nuclear war. Days later, they backed off of that. And so I think that the sources that I'm talking with within President Trump's political orbit view that as a signal. Now, all of that said, I think that, again, when you look at it from a broader standpoint of the rise of people like General H.R. McMaster within the administration, more aligned with the Gary Cohns of the world, I think that that would seemingly indicate a much more traditional establishment-friendly type of military strategy that, quite candidly, Vonnie, has a lot more folks here in Washington and within the military community a bit more at ease.